And Judges begins with the death of Joshua, right? And it basically tells the story of Israel's total failure to do what he had hoped for them to do and what God had hoped for them to do. And the book's name comes from the types of leaders that they had. We don't think about judges in a courtroom, of course. These are military and political leaders, more like tribal chieftains. They're judges. And certain moments here in the book are very disturbing and violent. And it tells a tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption and their bad leadership. And basically they have moved into the land and they become no different than the Canaanites that they're living in and around. And this sad story is meant for something. There's a purpose there. It's not just all bad. It's meant to generate hope for the future. And we can see this in the way that the book is laid out, I think. And so in the first chapter, we see this large introduction that kind of sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites. And in this large section, it has stories about the growing corruption of Israel's judges. And the progression shows that the leaders go from pretty good to okay to bad and then to worse. And the concluding section is really disturbing. And it shows the complete corruption of Israel as a whole. And so, looking at the opening section of the book of Judges, we see that it begins with the tribes of Israel and their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there's still a lot of land left to be taken and a lot of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives this long list of Canaanite groups and towns in Israel that just failed to drive out of the land. And we remember that the whole point of driving out these Canaanites from the land is to rid Israel and try to separate them from the moral corruption and their way of worshiping gods other than God and child sacrifice. And God has called Israel to be a holy people, and that just does not happen. And so in chapter 2, it describes how Israel just moved right in alongside the Canaanites and adopted all their cultural and religious practices. And it's right here that the story stops. For nearly a whole chapter, the narrator gives us an overview of everything that's about to happen in the body of the book. And this part of Israel's history, the narrator says, is a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral, right? And so Israel's history and the way that it operates looks just like the Canaanites. And the way the cycle works is they would sin against God. And God would allow them then to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites. And eventually, the Israelites would see the error of their ways. They would repent. And then God would raise up a deliverer or a judge from among Israel who would come and defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. And so this cycle would just go, and it goes and goes through the book. It starts all over again. Sin, oops, here's a deliverer, okay, we're back in peaceful times. So the stories of the three judges, first at least the three main judges that we meet, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, are epic adventures. They're also extremely bloody stories. Either the judges themselves or people who helped the judges defeat their enemies and deliver the people. And the stories about the next three judges are longer, and they focus on the character flaws of these judges, which get increasingly worse. And so Gideon, he's pretty good guy, but he's a little bit of a coward of a man. But he eventually comes to trust God and can save Israel through him. And he defeats a huge army of Midianites with only 300 men carrying torches and clay pots, which is impressive. But Gideon has a nasty temper, and he murders a bunch of fellow Israelites for not helping him in his battle. And then it just goes downhill from there. He makes an idol from the gold that he had gotten out of the wars, and then after he dies, all of Israel worships the idol that was made from gold, and the cycle starts all over again. And the next main judge is Jephthah, and that's who I want to focus in on this morning. That's who I want us to think about and talk about. And so I'm going to skip him, and we'll come back to him in just a minute. The last judge is Samson, and is by far the worst of all the judges. He has no regard for the God of Israel. He's promiscuous. He's violent. He's arrogant. He did win brutally some strategic battles against the Philistines at the expense of his own integrity, really. And his life ends in this violent rush of mass murder. And we notice that all throughout the main section, this theme is repeated, that at key moments, God's Spirit will empower each one of these judges to accomplish these great acts of deliverance. And so the fact that God uses these very flawed, I want to emphasize very flawed people, doesn't mean that He endorses all or any of their decisions. And God is committed first and foremost to saving His people. And it's a wonderful story, and immediately I think you're hearing the application. I do when I read it, when I think about it. God wants to save His people, but all He has to work with are these judges. And so work with them He does, and it's easy to see how these bad things have deteriorated in the way that they live and the decisions and lives that they carry out. You really can't even tell the difference between the Israelites and the Canaanites anymore. And that's just the leaders. The final section here in the book of Judges shows Israel as a whole hitting bottom. And there are two tragic stories back there at the back of the book, and they're not for the faint of heart. They're structured by this key line that gets repeated 4 times at the close of the book, and it says this: "In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." That's actually the last sentence of the book. The first story back here in the back is about an Israelite named Micah, and he builds a temple to an idol. And that gets plundered by a private army that's sent by the tribe of Dan. So they come and they steal everything, and then they go and they burn down a peaceful city of Laish and murder all its inhabitants. It's a horrible story. And Israel forgets its God. Might makes right. And then the final story is even worse. It's a shocking tale of sexual abuse and violence, which leads Israel's first civil war. It's extremely disturbing. And that's the point. These stories are meant to serve as a warning. Israel's descent into self-destruction is a result of turning away from God, who loves them and saved them out of slavery from Egypt. And now Israel needs to be delivered again from themselves. The only glimmer of hope in this story is found in this repeated line as the last part of the book. And it actually, like I said, is the last sentence. But it talks about Israel not having a king. And so the stage is set for the following books to tell the origins of King David's family, the book of Ruth, and to tell the origins of the kingship in Israel, the book of 1 Samuel. But the book of Judges has value as a tragedy. And it's a sobering explanation of the human condition. And ultimately, it points to the need for God's grace to send a king who will rescue His people. And that is the book of Judges. And so what I want us to zero in on and focus in on while we have time is Jephthah. And I've probably got enough material for about a quarter of study, which is my fault. But I'm going to try to do my best to editorialize as I move forward so that we're not bogged down in any kind of maybe tedious weeds or points or details. I'd also like to just offer, as we're passing by the 50-minute mark of the hour, that if you have any questions or comments or observations or criticisms, please let me know. Please feel free to speak up. Raise a hand. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Boy, no kidding. We could be, couldn't we? Boy, when's the last time we had good leadership? Godly leadership. I I was born under the same year that President Reagan was inaugurated. It's when I was born. He was pretty good. He wasn't perfect at all. But when I think about good presidents, I kind of think about him, at least that I've known, because you think about in your lifetime, right? You think about what you know. But you're right. This is, America has fallen, and the idea of moving in alongside other people and letting their practices and their traditions kind of inculcate our experience and the way that we live our lives, boy, that hits home. That hits home for me. That kind of thing, honestly, I don't know that happens to people where they think, I'm just going to disregard God. I don't think that has to happen. It can happen insidiously without us seeing it happening. At least to me, it happens to me that way, where I stop and kind of turn back around and look at myself and think, wow, yeah, right.
That has ambulance services, all this stuff that's like, where did this come from? It came from word of mouth, talking to friends, and yeah, our church does this. Is very inspirational. Well, let's try it.
Right. Right. Yes.
Please.
Yeah.
It feels good to us, and it's got to be pleasing.
Exactly. That's the thought. I kind of think about. I got this new book in the past several months about major interpreters of the Bible. And it talks about Luther and Calvin and, all theologians through time. And the interesting thing to me is there's a and this is not like, what a great point. It's a little point, but it's a point. I think kind of along the lines of what you're saying. There's a thought of, if the Bible doesn't say not to do it, let's do it. And boy, that's very popular. We see that with Jephthah too.
I've had people throughout the years say, "Yeah, you go to that church that doesn't have music. That's always the first thing to think."
Mm-hmm.
Don't do that. Why not?
Yep.
Well, we're not told we can. Well, then undoubtedly it's okay. And I think, when I was a kid, my mother would say, "You can go play in the backyard." So I could go play in the backyard. But if I went to the neighbor's house or the front yard, she didn't tell me I couldn't.
Oh, yeah.
It's the same thing. She told me where to go. God tells us how to worship.
Yes.
He tells us that, so he doesn't have to go through that 100 million mile list of the things we can't do.
It's so logical and so obvious when you put it so simply that way.
And
yeah.
It's like people go, "Oh no, that's not." I said, "Yeah."
Right.
Something.
You did that thing. Yeah.
Play in the front yard or your neighbor's yard because they came and got you. Then, your world's going to end as you know it.
Yes. And as a parent, that's terrifying. I told them to be here. Where are they? In immediate panic. Something wrong has happened. Something's gone wrong in our communication.
Exactly. In other words, kid didn't listen.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's an excellent point. The reason I want to zero in on Jephthah is because as I was kind of studying this past week and a half, I noticed that Jephthah is one of those that we find in Hebrews, where it talks about the heroes of faith chapter in chapter 11. And Jephthah is there in chapter 11 of Hebrews 32. But so is Gideon and Barak and Samson and Othniel and Ehud and Deborah. They're all there, and they're perfectly beneficial character studies as well. But this section of text in Jephthah has proven to be one of the more controversial sections of text within the Old Testament, at least within the last 8 centuries or so. And interestingly to me, it kind of sat there uncontested with nary a peep for centuries. And then an explosion of controversy exploded surrounding Jephthah's vow with his daughter, creating a polemical divide where modern scholarship is ready to go to the mat defending their interpretations of this thing. And so I thought it might be kind of interesting for us this morning to pull back the curtain on that and kind of step into the fray, as it were, and see what all the ruckus is about in that section of Scripture. And so we see that Jephthah, much like David, is an unlikely hero. He's an outcast. He's an underdog. I like underdogs. but his political and military potential and talent becomes clear. And when things get really bad for Israel, the elders come to him begging for help, and Jephthah proves to be a very effective leader, and he won lots of battles against the Ammonites. But he's so unfamiliar with God, the God of Israel, he treats him like a Canaanite god. And he vows to sacrifice his daughter if he wins a battle. And the tragic story shows just how far Israel has fallen, really. They no longer know the character of their own God, which leads to murder and false worship. And so just to kind of set the scene, I'm tempted to skip this, but just to kind of quickly do it, if you'll allow me, I'm going to start Judges chapter 10, verses 6 through 18, just to kind of get a foothold here. Judges 10, 6 through 18. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, worshiping the Baals and the Astartes. By the way, there's going to be a lot of names through here of gods, and they'll be different editions. I'm reading from the New Revised this morning, so if you see something different, that's why. Worshipping the Baals and the Astartes, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. Thus they abandoned the Lord and did not worship him. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the Ammonites, and they crushed and oppressed the Israelites that year. For 18 years they oppressed the Israelites that were beyond the Jordan in the land of the Amorites, which is in Gilead. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah and against Benjamin and against the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was greatly distressed. So the Israelites cried to the Lord, saying, "We have sinned against you because we have abandoned our God and have worshipped the Baals." And the Lord said to the Israelites, "Did I not deliver you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and from the Ammonites and from the Philistines? The Sidonians also and the Amalekites, the Moabites oppressed you. You cried to me and I delivered you out of their hand. You have abandoned me and worshipped other gods. Therefore, I will deliver you no more. Go and cry to the gods whom you've chosen. Let them deliver you in the time of your distress." And the Israelites said to the Lord, "We have sinned. Do to us whatever seems good to you, Lord, but deliver us this day." So they put away the foreign gods from among themselves and worshiped the Lord. And he could no longer bear to see Israel suffer. Then the Ammonites were called to arms, and they encamped in Gilead, and the Israelites came together, and they encamped at Mizpah. The commanders of the people of Gilead said to one another, "Who will begin the fight against the Ammonites? Whoever it is, he shall be the head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." So just kind of quickly thinking about where we're at on the map. I had some maps here this morning, but it's fine. I think how many times have we seen the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea? We can all imagine this, right? And the Jordan River connects them, okay? So if the Jordan River is here, and we've got the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea down here, this area right here to the east of the Jordan is Gilead. And when we read Mizpah in the Bible, there's actually two. There may be a lot more than two. We're not really sure. Scholars aren't sure. But there's a Mizpah in Gilead, which is east of the Jordan. And that's the one we're thinking about this morning when we read about Mizpah. And it's mentioned previously in Joshua and Deuteronomy. There's also a Mizpah that's about 12 miles north of Jerusalem, right over here, and that's the Mizpah of Benjamin, is what it's called. There's been excavations there a lot more extensively than the one in Gilead, and they've found gates and walls and things like that. But that's kind of where we are. As the Israelites came out of Egypt, they came and they stopped at Kadesh, right? And they kind of held down here, and Jephthah talks about this in his speech with the Ammonite king. But instead of coming across like they wanted to, they didn't want to infringe on people's territory. They were praying to God and having him guide them as they did this. So they swung around. The Moabites area was right here. And then the river Arnon runs just like this out of the Dead Sea, which is the border for the Moabites. So they would swing around so they don't infringe upon the Moabites, and they would come around, coming into Canaan, And the Amorites lived right here. The Ammonites are off to the east, so that there's a section where they could come in, not infringing upon anybody, and it's the Amorites that they defeated. That's who that was their first military conquering quest coming into the land of Canaan. It wasn't the Ammonites, it was the Amorites. Different people altogether. And so, let me pick up here, chapter 11, first 3 verses. Now Jephthah the Gileadite, the son of a prostitute, was a mighty warrior. Gilead was the father of Jephthah. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah away, saying to him, "You shall not inherit anything in our father's house, for you're the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Outlaws collected around Jephthah and went raiding with him. So we see just here very early that Jephthah is born under a very dark cloud. He's the son of Gilead, who is the grandson of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. And he's the founder of the clan, but his mother is a harlot. She's a prostitute or a strange woman. It's possible she might not have even been an Israelite, which would have been a very big deal, among other things. But living in his father's house, Jephthah's deprived of his family rights and his legitimacy. And eventually, he's thrust out by his stepbrothers, which is an event that's going to scar him and embitter him, and it's going to cast a shadow over his future. But he became a leader among this rough group of people. These are the dregs of society. These aren't good guys. It's a bit reminiscent of David being thrown out by Saul, but this rough and tough misfortune certainly prepared Jephthah and will prepare him for military duty and leadership in his life. So let's continue on here, chapter 11, verse 4 through 11. After a time, the Ammonites made war with Israel, and when the Ammonites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the land of Tob, and they said to Jephthah, "Come and be our commander, so that we may fight the Ammonites." Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "Are you not the very ones who rejected me and drove me out of my father's house? So why do you come to me now, when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "Nevertheless, we have now turned back to you, so that you may go with us and fight the Ammonites and become head over us, over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "If you bring me home again to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, I will be your head." And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "The Lord will be the witness between us. We will surely do as you say." So Jephthah went to the elders of Gilead. He went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord at Mizpah. So there's a lot here to unpack. Maybe the first thing we see is that the elders of Gilead are pretty desperate. These raids that they were running in, if this is the Jordan and the Ammonites are coming in here, it says they're not only coming into Gilead, they're also making excursions into Benjamin and all the other lands where they are, the Ephraim and all the other places. The Israelites are in trouble, and they know they're in trouble. And you can hear and see their desperation in the fact that they come to Jephthah and they say, "Look, you can have whatever you want. We need your help. This is an existential problem. And whatever you think you need." We see that Jephthah is an opportunist. He's very ambitious. These aren't attributes that you would immediately love to see, obviously. He recognizes that I'm going to come down here and defeat these guys, and then they're going to kick me out just like they always did. And so I'm going to make sure that this is a permanent position that I'm setting up. He's basically going to be a local dictator for life. And they say, "Sure, if you kick out the Ammonites, tell you what, you go for it. You'll be the dictator and you'll be our head." And so this is this is bringing Jephthah out from being an outcast. He's now going to be brought back into society, normal society. This is a huge deal. We see the pride of Jephthah. We see the elders swallowing their pride. They're humbling themselves. They're coming back to God in this process. Here's the judge that God's offering up for the people to help deliver them from this oppression. And I think it's important to point out, not to be so down on Jephthah, that while his self-seeking impulse is evident, his strong faith in God is also evident. Because he says that it would be the Lord who would be the real deliverer in verse 9. And this agreement between Jephthah and the elders is sealed in a ceremony. It's almost a coronation at a local sanctuary in Mizpah in verses 10 and 11. And we see that God is invoked as a witness to this agreement, which are all very good signs. So I'm going to quickly read through here. This is going to be Jephthah's first step out as a statesman. So it's Jephthah, verse 12. Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites and said, "What is there between you and me, that you have come to me to fight against my land?" The king of the Ammonites answered the messengers of Jephthah. He said, "Because Israel, on coming from Egypt, took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok and to the Jordan. Now therefore restore it peacefully." Once again, Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites, and he said to him, "Thus says Jephthah, Israel did not take away the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites. But when they came up from Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea and came to Kadesh. Israel then sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, 'Let us pass through your land.' But the king of Edom wouldn't listen. They also sent to the king of Moab, but he would not consent. So Israel remained at Kadesh. Then they journeyed through the wilderness, went around the land of Edom and around the land of Moab, arrived on the east side of the land of Moab, and camped on the other side of the Arnon. They did not enter the territory of Moab, for the Arnon was the boundary of Moab. Israel then sent messengers to King Sihon of the Amorites, the king of Heshbon. And Israel said to him, 'Let us pass through your land to our country.' But Sihon did not trust Israel to pass through his territory, so Sihon gathered all his people together and encamped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. Then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and all his people into the hand of Israel, and they defeated them. So Israel occupied all the land of the Amorites who inhabited that country. They occupied all the territory of the Amorites from the Arnon to the Jabbok and from the wilderness to Jordan. So now the Lord, the God of Israel, has conquered the Amorites for the benefit of his people Israel. Do you intend to take their place? Should you not possess what your God Chemosh gives you to possess? And should we not be the ones to possess everything that the Lord our God has conquered for our benefit? Now, are you any better than the king Balak, son of Zippor of Moab? Did he ever enter into conflict with Israel? Or did he ever go to war with them? While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and the Aroer and its villages, and in all the towns that are along the Arnon, 300 years. Why did you not recover them within that time? Is it not I who have sinned against you? But it is not I who have sinned against you, but you are the one who does me wrong by making war on me. Let the Lord, who is judge, decide today for the Israelites or the Ammonites. But the king of the Ammonites did not heed the message that Jephthah had sent him. So the first thing that Jephthah does is to point out to the king of the Ammonites that I'm not the aggressor here, you're the aggressor here. This is the situation. I'm defending my people. You're coming in, you're attacking, you're the aggressor. He's setting up the elements for his rhetorical argument. He then launches into this statement of history that shows a very astute and together and informed knowledge of Israel and how they've come to be where they are. And passed through certain areas and how it was dealt with. And he points out and takes great care to say we haven't infringed on anyone. The Lord has handed this over. And by the way, we've been here a really long time. Where have you been? You haven't asked for any of this back, and so here you are all of a sudden. You'd really like this land back. That doesn't really make sense. And furthermore, it's not your land to begin with. He makes a pretty convincing argument. I guess if you're an Israelite, if you're an Ammonite, you might not have liked it so much, and the king didn't really care for it. He thought, well, your version of history is interesting, but that's all rubbish, and I don't really care what you have to say about any of this. It's interesting that he says God will decide. You pray to your God, I'll pray to mine, and we'll see how it comes out that way. F.F. Bruce, a commentator, puts it this way. He says, the message he sent to the king of Ammon, with its historical retrospect reaching back to the Exodus and wilderness wanderings, expresses his appreciation of God always giving guidance to his people in those early days, and his confidence that Yahweh will judge their cause today. This is totally off subject and at a time that I don't need to do it. I would just like to say, because I've had a conversation about this week. I see the word F.F. Bruce uses the word Yahweh. There's a guy that I know. Boy, I hope this is worthy. There's a guy that I know that uses Yahweh all the time, in the church. Not here in Texas. It's somewhere else. But he constantly says Yahweh this and Yahweh that, and that may be okay. And I don't mean to pick on little things that are really no big deal. But I think it's interesting. I just want to make the point. And I've talked to him about this, and we've laughed together about it. So this isn't like a big controversial thing. But Yahweh isn't used ever in the New Testament. Not one time. Not one time does Peter say Yahweh, or Paul, or John, or Matthew, or Luke. I think that's interesting. We can talk about Yahweh in the Old Testament. And maybe that would be a good Bible class. It would be a good study to kind of look into that. Never in the New Testament one time does someone invoke the name Yahweh. So I think it's interesting that we would preach and use it and say it and throw it around when we have absolutely no example of that in the New Testament. Anyway, that's just an aside. Let's get into the meat of this. Here comes Jephthah. He's defeated. I'm going to kind of skip through here. He's defeated the Ammonites now. Where are we? Let's get his vow. Then verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh. He passed on to Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, and he said, if you give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return victorious from the Ammonites, shall be the Lord's. So he says, whoever comes out, that's going to be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites. He fought them. I'm kind of editorializing, forgive me. He inflicts massive defeat, and he's victorious. Verse 34, Jephthah came to his home in Mizpah, and there his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrels and dancing. She was his only child, it says. He had no son or daughter except for her. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You have become the cause of great trouble for me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. And she said to him, my father, if you have opened your mouth to the Lord, do to me according to what was gone out of your mouth. Now that the Lord has given you vengeance against your enemies, the Ammonites. And she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Grant me 2 months, that I may wander on the mountains and bewail my virginity with my companions. Go, he said, and he sent her away for 2 months. So she departed, she and her companions, and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. At the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did according to the vow that he had made. She had never slept with a man. So there arose an Israelite custom that for 4 days every year the daughters of Israel would go out to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. So this is the controversy. this is the situation that we find ourselves. There are basically, let me find this here. There are basically two schools of thought. Did Jephthah sacrifice his daughter, or did he commit her to a life of celibacy? And that, for years, when this is read, of course he sacrificed his daughter. That's obviously the plain meaning of the text. He gets home, and there she is. She's the first one out. He said he's vowed to God he's going to sacrifice in a burnt offering. And so he has to kill, he thinks he has to. He doesn't. There's all kinds of Jewish laws and things that can get him out of this. Does he kill her, or does he commit her to a life of celibacy? And the way that this celibacy idea has come up, basically just to cut short, is Latin monasticism happens in the Middle Ages, toward the end of the Middle Ages. And there's this Karaite thinker who is in the Middle East who gets contact with these Latin monastic bishops and things who are coming into the Middle East. And he shares this idea about, well, what about monasteries? What about nuns? He might have just committed her to celibacy. Instead, it doesn't say he killed her. And so it creates this debate and this conversation within all kinds of groups who say, well, you know, that's right. Maybe he didn't. He wouldn't have done that. He would have known better. And female celibacy, just to make a couple quick points, it is completely unknown in the ancient Near Eastern records. There's not a single example. There's not a single example in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. There's not an example of secular writings. And non-sacrificial adherents admit this, that there's no examples of it. We don't see it anywhere else. And just to kind of put a quick cap on this, there's a really great scholar on this area of debate named Joshua Berman. And he has some great quotes. There's a difference between interpretation and interpolation. Interpretation is when you read a text and you try to dig into its cultural and social situations and try to understand, getting to the original language, what the meaning is of that text. Interpolation is when you take your situation and put it onto the text. And that is basically what's happening when you come from an environment of Latin monasticism with nunneries and these groups in the Middle Ages, and they see the situation that they live in, and here they put it right here on the text. And that basically, and you may disagree, I'm cool with that. That's okay. But Joshua Berman thinks that's exactly what's happened. I think that he's right. I think that happens all the time too as we study the Bible. It's a temptation, and we need to be careful that when we're reading Scripture, we're seeing it for what it is, not what we think it is. Any final comments or questions before we finish this morning? I know that's hard and fast. Thank you all very much for your attention.